Namaskar and good afternoon everyone, and good evening to the audience who are joining us from India. Our today's topic under India-Ireland Friendship Lecture Series is From Indo-Europeans to Independence, 3000 Years of India and Ireland. The connections between India and Ireland are deep into the history when both the civilizations were flourishing, going through many upheavals. Both were colonized and got their independence after an intense struggle for freedom, influencing each other as the fight for freedom was also simultaneous. The connections may also be seen in the Indo-European languages that descended from a single prehistoric language, having a remarkable structural relationship. Some of these languages, such as English, Hindi, Urdu, Spanish, French, Russian, German and Punjabi are still alive in parts of Europe and Asia. To speak on today's topic as guest speaker, we have with us Dr. Matthew Potter, who is Curator of Limerick Museum and Honorary Fellow of the Department of History, University of Limerick. He is also a historical advisor to many government authorities. He is the author of numerous books and articles, mainly on the history of Limerick and of Irish local government. He also has keen interest in the history of India. Before I request Mr. Potter to enlighten us on the subject, I request His Excellency the Ambassador for his introductory remarks.
Namaskar, my warm greetings to all, especially friends in India who are following this program online. My very warm greetings from Dublin, Ireland. Friends, we are very delighted to have someone like Dr. Potter. My wife Lethi and I had great privilege of visiting the Limerick Museum and having an interaction with Dr. Potter. We were so touched by not only his very profound knowledge, but his very genuine spirit of scholarship and everlasting inquisitiveness about the history of our two countries. We feel in the Indian Embassy that the real strength of our partnership between our two countries is really the affinity, very natural, genuine affinity and warmth that exists between the people of Ireland and people of India. We are very keen that that old spirit which energized our freedom struggle and the sense of camaraderie and solidarity that we enjoyed at the time of our freedom struggle and also even after that, as two independent developed countries, we shared a lot. We had our leadership and also our intellectuals and thinkers. They worked together. They shared everything they could for the mutual enrichment of both sides. We are very keen that the same spirit should be revived, and we should work for greater people-to-people connectivity, not only in the field of education and entrepreneurship and technology and investments, but also in the intellectual domain, in the cultural domain. And even as two vibrant democracies having a republican constitution, our people have a lot to learn from each other, a lot to share with each other in terms of our developmental experiences in a very vibrant, free, open, democratic framework. And in that context, we are very privileged to have someone like Dr. Potter. He symbolizes the spirit of friendship between India and Ireland. His knowledge, his profound understanding, deep empathy and love and kindness for India and the people of India is very touching. We are very, very delighted to welcome you, Dr. Potter, and we look forward to listening to you. Traditionally, we have our scholars have focused on the independence struggles and the late 19th century or early 20th century, but nobody has educated us about 3,000 years of connection. So this is the topic that you have chosen. Very kindly you have agreed to share your think we are all looking forward to listening to your presentation. Thank you so much. May I invite you?
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I'm very touched by your very kind comments, and it was a great privilege and pleasure to receive you and your colleagues in the Limerick Museum at the beginning of June of this year. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the connection between India and Ireland over the last 3,000 years or so, which is why the lecture is called From Indo-Europeans to Independence. I suppose at this point I should point out that there are two very outstanding books on the topic of Ireland-India relations, and one is called Ireland-India, Colonies, Culture and Empire, and the authors of that are Ty Foley and Maureen O'Connor. And the other one then is Ireland and India, Connections, Comparisons, Contrasts, edited by Michael Holmes and Dennis Holmes. So these two books are very, very informative about the connection between Ireland and India. So that they would be very much considered standard works on the topic. So I would begin by, I suppose, looking at the origins of the connection between Ireland and India. And this goes back to the Indo-European migrations, because a very large portion of the world's languages are Indo-European languages. The Indo-European languages comprise virtually all of the languages of Europe, the Celtic languages, the Slavic languages, the Romance languages, as well as the Iranian languages and of course the languages of northern India. And collectively the speakers of Indo-European languages, they make up about half of the world's population. But the Indo-Europeans, as this map shows here, their origins were in an area, ironically, that is now very topical at the moment, the area of the Ukraine, the area to the north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And this is where it's thought that Indo-European languages originated. And it's thought that Proto-Indo-European was a language that was spoken by all of the Indo-European ancestral peoples at the very beginning of the process, but that then subsequently the languages spread out all over Europe and Western Asia. Now, of course, for many years it was not realised that there was this connection, and it came about when a number of scholars, particularly British scholars, when they were establishing their control over India, a gentleman called Sir William Jones was one of the pioneers, and he noticed that Hindi, the Sanskrit and the various languages that derived from Sanskrit, including Hindi, were very similar to Greek and Latin. And of course, he was educated, as most educated Europeans at the time were, in the classics, in Greek and Latin literature and history. So he was astonished to find that there were such similarities between the Indian languages and the Greek and Latin languages. And this then led to the whole study of philology of languages. It developed really from that point. And then it was discovered then that the languages all had a common origin. But then, of course, this led then to, this was of course in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then it was assumed, of course, that the bearers of these languages, the speakers of these languages, that they had invaded the bulk of Europe as well as modern-day Iran, large parts of Central Asia, and of course northern India, and that they had come in great numbers and they had conquered the indigenous populations in all of this vast part of the world. And of course this was because this was the mentality at the time. This was at the age of imperialism, so it was assumed that just like the Europeans were carving up the world in the 19th and into the 20th century, it was also assumed that the Indo-Europeans many thousands of years before had done similar things, had started off in one homeland in what's now, as I say, Ukraine and Russia, and then spread out and conquered by force the various countries where the languages were spoken. But that is not considered to be the case now. In the 20th century and the 21st century, a much more nuanced view emerged. And for example, I'm sure all of you are familiar with the concept that the Indo-Aryans invaded northern India around 1500 BC or thereabouts. The dates, of course, vary, and that they came in huge numbers. It used to be thought, for example, that they destroyed Harappan civilization in what is now Pakistan. And similarly, it was thought, which will come to a minute, that the Celts then were another great, the Celtic languages are another great family of Indo-European languages. They likewise conquered large parts of Europe and came in great numbers, and particularly they came to Ireland in great numbers and settled in Ireland. And of course, there was some reasoning behind this, because the whole concept of, for example, the domestication of the horse, the invention of the chariot, this is thought to have originated in Central Asia as well, in what's now Ukraine, Russia, that particular area. And of course, this gave a great advantage over the warriors from these particular areas over the warriors in other parts of the civilized world. So, for example, civilizations as far-flung as China, as Egypt, as the Hittites or sorry, not the Hittites, the Mycenaeans and so on. They had all spread. The invaders, the Indo-European invaders, supposedly had invaded all of these parts of the world and overthrown them. But it's now thought, in fact, that if I look first of all at India, that the indigenous population, first of all, the Harappan civilization wasn't destroyed by the Indo-Aryans. It had already declined to the point of collapse before they arrived. And the second thing is that the number of Indo-Aryans that came to India was probably very small, and that the vast bulk of the population remained the same, but that they began to speak the Indo-Aryan languages that came in, Sanskrit and all the various languages that descended from Sanskrit. And so this began around 1500 BC in India, and by about 600 BC, then the whole of northern India then had become largely Indo-Aryan speaking, whereas the Dravidian languages continue to be spoken in the south of India, still do, of course. And it is considered by a lot of scholars that they were spoken all over India before the Indo-Aryans arrived. Now, if we look at the Celts in Europe, a similar process occurred. The Celts came over then from Eastern Europe. They conquered all the area here that you can see is in green. It's thought that the Celtic homeland was the yellow area there in Central Europe. And again, it was thought that starting off there, they invaded places like modern France, modern Spain, Britain, and a great area of Eastern Europe, and even Central Asia Minor, modern Turkey. But again, it's now thought that instead of maybe hundreds of thousands of invaders or tens of thousands, that there were only a small number. That probably what happened was it was an elite that came and took over, and that the vast bulk of the population remained the same as they had been before, but they simply started speaking the languages of the Indo-European languages. And of course, the Celts ended up then in turn by being conquered by the Romans. So the Celtic languages end up being concentrated in the areas you can see there in dark green, namely Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and of course Brittany. So I suppose you can even see nowadays how language shift occurs. If you look at, say, Australia now, for example, or North America, what happened there was that the vast majority of the indigenous population were either destroyed or reduced in numbers, and a huge influx of mainly European colonists came to live there. But then if you look at the Arab countries, for example, it's thought a similar process occurred to what happened in, say, in India, that instead of, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Arabs spreading out of Arabia at the time of, after the death of Muhammad, that in actual fact, that many Arabs did settle in the Middle East and North Africa and conquer those countries, but the vast majority of the population remained, and that they actually started speaking Arabic. So it was language shift in that sense rather than the displacement of the original population. In fact, it's apart from the Europeans, the European settlements in North America and Australia, New Zealand, and in parts of the southern cone of South America, it's not that usual for the entire population of a particular area to be wiped out and replaced by a new population. It's more likely to happen that the population remains the same and that they actually take on the culture and the language of the new elite. So that's what happened in both Ireland and in India, according to the most modern scholarship. And it's very interesting then to see how, no, it has to be said, while I speak about 3,000 years of India and Ireland, there was a very long period then that the connection between the two were quite small. But it is interesting to see the parallels that occurred, that there was a parallel development between the two, in that India, of course, had what's called a second urbanization and a second civilization developed after the destruction of the Harappans. So then from 600 BC, 500 BC or thereabouts in the Indo-Gangetic plain, and the modern Indian civilization started, and it then, of course, reached its climax. It is often thought during the period of Govt dynasty from roughly 300 to 600 AD. And again, interestingly, what happened was that historians in the 19th, 20th century, they created the idea that this was India's golden age. And of course, it was a golden age. It was, of course, a period of great cultural significance. It was also a period when Indian civilization was spreading all over Southeast Asia, and of course Buddhism and indeed Hinduism had spread. Hinduism had spread, of course, into Southeast Asia, but Buddhism spread throughout Asia, and at one stage, around the 7th or 8th century, was by far the largest religion in the world in terms of its followers, number of followers, I should say. Whereas at the same period, Christianity was quite confined just to more or less boxed in by Islam in Western Europe. But the creation of a golden age in historiography was a period long before the major modern invasions. And of course, it is now realized that Indian civilization, pre-Muslim civilization, it didn't just suddenly stop around 600 at the end of the Guptas. It continued to flourish really for about another 600 years. And it's interesting to see the parallels. In Ireland, likewise, the arrival of Christianity, St. Patrick is traditionally considered to be the Apostle of Ireland, but St. Patrick didn't just bring Christianity to Ireland, he brought literacy. For the pre-Christian Irish were non-literate people. So this in turn then led to a flourishing of Irish civilization. And so again in the 19th century in Ireland, the concept of a golden age of Ireland was created by modern nationalists. And again, it was similar to the golden age of India. It was well before the foreign invasions. And again, in both cases, it wasn't a myth in the sense that there was no basis at all in it, but it was very much a sort of, the concept of a golden age was created very much by 19th century and early 20th century historians and nationalists. And of course, that didn't just happen in Ireland or in India. It happened all over the world at this period. And then another interesting parallel then is you can see that Irish civilization did continue then for a long period after the so-called Golden Age came to an end. It's often thought that the Golden Age, when I was at school, it was thought the Vikings, when they came to Ireland, put an end to it. But in actual fact, it's now realised that the Vikings had a relatively relatively being the right word, of course, they didn't have as profound and destructive a role in Irish civilization as was thought. So Ireland had its own sort of indigenous civilization, separate from that of Western Christendom. Yes, Ireland had become a Christian country, but really until the arrival of the Normans, then the English, that was really brought Ireland forcibly into the mainstream. And it's interesting to see the parallels again, that in 1169 the Normans came to Ireland, beginning the period of English/British rule in Irish history, which is still, of course, not concluded insofar as that Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom. And likewise in India then, while there had been previous invasions, of course, you had various Indo-European invaders after the original Indo-Aryans. You had the famous Kushan Empire, for example. You had the White Huns then, who were, of course, were a totally different ethnic group. They were more related to the Mongols and to the Turks. But in 1169, I'd say the big turning point in Irish history was the arrival of the English and the British, one of the great turning points in Irish history. And then 1175, the beginning of the Islamic period in the history, the beginning of the Muslim invasions. Of course, there had been Muslim invasions in as early as the beginning of the 8th century, when parts of Western India had been occupied by the caliphs and the Arab caliphs. But and then you had the infamous Mahmud of Ghazni, then, who in the first 30 years of the 11th century was notorious for his destructive raids on northern India. But to actually invade and occupy large parts of India, that didn't really start until 1175 with another major Islamic ruler, Muhammad of Ghur. And then, of course, his empire then, after it ended, then it was the sultans of Delhi then, of course, who took over northern India. And in both cases, again, the conquest it took centuries to complete. First of all, the English did not occupy Ireland in its entirety, and indeed many of the local, the lords, the Anglo-Norman lords who came to Ireland in the Middle Age, they became Hibernicized, they adopted the Irish language and they adopted Irish culture. And of course the same happened with the Muslim invaders of India, the various Turks and Afghans and so on, who invaded India from 1175 onwards. Many of them, of course, brought, it's interesting to note as well, where the English invaders of Ireland, they actually brought what really was a sort of a French civilization with them, because the Normans had come from northern France. And likewise, the Muslim invaders of India, what they brought really with them was a Persian civilization, which reached its climax under the Mughals. So, however, I suppose it's fair to say that the most intimate relationship between Ireland and India dated from the British conquest of both countries. Now, again, of course, the British involvement in Ireland was much earlier than that of India, and it lasted much longer. But in a nutshell, the English had been in Ireland since 1169, but they didn't really complete the conquest of the entire country in 1603, so it was a very piecemeal process. And even after that conquest was completed, Ireland had its own separate parliament until 1800. Now, it was a parliament that was controlled in the 17th, for most of the 17th and all of the 18th century by a Protestant elite descended from English and to some extent Scottish colonists, so it was by no means representative of the bulk of the population. But then in 1800, following the 1798 rebellion, Ireland was fully incorporated into the United Kingdom. It became an integral part of the United Kingdom. And of course, the conquest of India would have come, but by Britain came somewhat later. It really dated from the middle of the 18th century, with the collapse of the last of the great Muslim empires. The last and greatest of them was the Mughal Empire. Now, it should be said, it's often been claimed by especially British historians that they were responsible for uniting India and creating the modern Indian nation. But certainly it can be argued with a lot of cogency and strength that it was the Muslim invaders that really, there were of course pan-Indian empires, the Mauryas and the Guptas were the two great empires that encompassed nearly all of India before the Muslims, but from the Sultans of Delhi to the Mughals, there was a fair degree of continuity. So long before the British arrived, there was a concept that India as a whole was a natural unit and it should be under one government. It should be said, of course, that neither Europe nor India nor the Middle East, the three great civilizations, or Islam I should say, they didn't have the same degree of unity as China. China was the one of the great civilizations of the world, four great civilizations we might say, of China, India, Islam and the Western world. China is the only one that has been united much more often than it was divided. And of course that then creates a sort of a concept that why, you know, why wasn't Europe united and why wasn't India united and why wasn't the Islamic world united? I mean, there's no reason why they should have been united, because China was the exception rather than the rule. But anyway, just to go back to the point anyway, when the British conquered India, which really would say roughly from about 1757, the Battle of Plassey, up until about 1818, when the Marathas were finally conquered and the whole of India outside of the Punjab was actually under British rule. So the British really were stepping into the shoes of the Mughals and before that the Sultans of Delhi. So I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that there was no concept of an India before, one sort of state before the British arrived. But if you look at the parallels of Britain then, or with Ireland rather, really the imposition of direct rule by the British in India only came around 58 years after that it happened in Ireland. In 1800, the Irish Parliament was abolished, and then Ireland became part of the United Kingdom. Following the Great Rebellion of 1857, the East India Company, which was a private company, of course, that had run India for the British before that, was abolished, and then India was brought under direct British rule. So you could say that effectively Britain and Ireland, India and Ireland, they were most affected by British rule in the 19th and into the 20th centuries. It was much more intensive and pervasive than it had been before that. Now, of course, it is often the case that many Irish people would be aware that India and Ireland collaborated with each other in resisting British rule, but perhaps understandably a lot of Irish people would be uncomfortable with the notion that they actually contributed greatly to British rule in India. And that was the interesting thing about Ireland. It was both colonised and a coloniser as well, because certainly Irish nationalists saw themselves not as being part of the home country of the United Kingdom. They would have seen that they were a conquered country, whereas of course many other parts of the world that were under British rule, including India, we've seen the Irish as being the same as the Scots and the English and the Welsh. They were part of the colonising movement. They were part of the invading imperialist regime. And of course, this is not unique to Ireland and Britain. I mean, if you look at, for example, the French, hundreds of thousands of Algerians, for example, fought in the French army. 100,000 died in fact, in the First World War. Hundreds of thousands of Poles and of Lithuanians and of Ukrainians were part of the Imperial Russian army, and indeed part of the Soviet army too, when the Soviet Union took over the job of running the Russian Empire. And likewise, the Irish were they were both part of the British Empire and also part of the resistance to the British Empire. And very interestingly, if you look, for example, at the Irish and British Army in the 19th and 20th centuries, the three major roles that the Irish played in the British Empire in India were in the military, in the civil service, and in as Christian missionaries. So the most important, of course, in terms of numbers anyway, were the Irish and the British Army. And if you look at the various British Indian armies, because there was an army for each of the three presidencies, or these were the three divisions, as you all know, that British India was divided into the presidency of Bengal and Bombay and Madras. So there's three armies, and there wasn't one Indian army until 1894 actually under the British. But half of all European recruits to the British Indian armies in the first half of the 19th century were Irish. I mean, that's an astonishing number. And it should also be understood that they were Catholic Irish because, for the most part, because, again, it's obviously taken for granted that the Protestant elite in Ireland were part of the British establishment. But what's less understood is that the Irish Catholics, who were supposedly not part of the British establishment, they were actually very much part of the British Army in India. Not only that, after the Indian Rebellion, I should say, of 1857, there was also a great number of British troops stationed in India. There was the Indian Army itself, which was officered by British officers, and then of course there was British regiments from the British Army who also were stationed in India. But if you look at the 1830s, for example, 42% of the British Army were Irish as well, mainly Catholic Irish. It's an interesting thing at the time of the Battle of Waterloo, for example, there were more Irish in the British Army than there were English or Scots. And so the British Empire was very much won and fought for by the Irish. There was a joke one time that the Irish fought for the British Empire, the Scots and the Welsh ran the empire, and then the English, they took all the profits. So that was the division of labour, according to this joke. But at the time of the Great Rebellion of 1857, of the 40,000 European troops in India, nearly half were Irish. Now, one of the reasons why the Irish were so prominent in the British Army was that at the beginning of the 19th century, the population of Ireland was very large. 1/3 of the United Kingdom was Irish. But then after the Great Famine of the 1840s, the population of Ireland dropped dramatically. The Irish, not only was there 1 million deaths during the famine, but huge numbers of Irish then emigrated. And that's the reason why Ireland today is about the only country in the entire world which has less people now than it had in the 1840s. But as the population of Ireland dropped, so did the number of Irish recruited to the British Armed Forces. But, very interestingly, the Anglo-Irish, the sort of the Protestant gentry in Ireland, they continue to be very prominent in the Indian Army. And so, for example, in the second half of the 19th century, no fewer than 30% of Indian Army officers were Irish. And of course, many of the big names that we're familiar with from the British Army in India were Anglo-Irish. And indeed, 3 commanders-in-chief of the Indian Army, that's of course the British Indian Army, were Irish. Lord Roberts, the notorious Lord Kitchener, of course, and Sir Claude Auchinleck, who was the last commander-in-chief of the Indian Army before independence. So, because I'm from Limerick myself, I should mention 2 major military figures who were involved in the conquest of India by the British. Sir Eyre Coote, who was from a town called Kilmallock in County Limerick. He was a major collaborator and fighter along with Robert Clive. In fact, he and Clive were actually enemies because he felt that Clive was taking the credit for his work. And then a later figure then was Field Marshal Lord Govt. He was also from County Limerick. His main claim to fame was that he was the conqueror of the Punjab in the 1840s. And he was considered to have been the most distinguished British soldier in the British Army in the 19th century after Wellington himself. Very nice. I'm just going to get rid of this thing here. Oh, it's gone. So, now of course, it's not to be imagined that these British military figures from Ireland were in the least bit sympathetic to India, or indeed that they were. Now, many of them were regarded as heroes in the 19th and into the 20th century, but a great many of them were far from being heroes. The 3 Lawrence brothers, for example, were administering the Punjab at the time of the Great Rebellion of 1857. And while they had been born in Britain, they were from County Derry, or Londonderry as it's sometimes called. And when, of course, the Great Rebellion broke out in 1857, Britain became inflamed by stories of the atrocities committed by the rebels, of the Indian rebels. But of course, the British then, when they suppressed the rebellion after considerable fighting, they committed possibly, almost certainly, far greater atrocities. And some of the atrocities were committed by some of the heroes of the event, including this gentleman here, one John Nicholson. Now he was from Lisburn, what is now Northern Ireland, and he took part in suppressing the rebellion. He was working with Sir John Lawrence, who later became the Viceroy of India. But both of them, but particularly Nicholson, committed appalling crimes, massacres, burnings, lootings, and Nicholson then was killed in the battle to capture Delhi back from the rebels. But he was regarded for many years as a hero, particularly in Northern Ireland. Among the Unionist population of Northern Ireland, he was very much revered, and also, of course, in the pantheon of British heroes. But he's now regarded as somebody described him as an imperial psychopath. So he's now regarded quite correctly as being one of the most notorious oppressors of the Indian population. His statue still, of course, stands in the town of Lisburn in Northern Ireland. Now, so that was the military involvement. And if we then look at the Indian Civil Service, the British set up a civil service. Originally it was run by the East India Company. Then after the Great Rebellion ended, it was taken over by direct British rule. And if you look at the senior positions in the Indian Civil Service were called covenanted positions. And after 1853, these were recruited by competitive examinations. Before that, it was done by patronage. It's interesting to note, again, a little aside, that Europeans used to pride themselves on inventing the idea of competitive examinations, but they didn't really give any credit to the fact that it was the Chinese who invented competitive examinations, and they did it actually over 1,000 years or more, 1,500 years in fact, before the Europeans, but that's slightly off the point. But if you look at the Irish then, in the early 19th century, 5% of the covenanted positions, the senior positions, were Irish. Then in the 1850s, 60s, there was a huge number of Irish, nearly a quarter of all of the senior Indian civil servants were Irish. And many of them were Catholic as well. In fact, the British themselves, the English, I should say, to be specific, became very annoyed that the Irish were becoming so numerous in the senior position of the English civil service, of the Indian civil service. They changed the rules then somewhat to disadvantage the Irish candidates. Now, the Irish candidates were mainly from, a lot of them were from the Protestant gentry. There was then groups from the Protestant middle classes, but there were also then a large number from the Catholic middle classes. And one of the most notorious of them, of course, was Sir Michael O'Dwyer, Lieutenant Governor of the Punjab during the time of the notorious Amritsar massacre. And he's a very interesting character because he was a Catholic Irishman. He would have been assumed to have been, and he was living at the time when the Home Rule movement in Ireland was very strong, when Charles Stewart Parnell was about to make Home Rule for the first time a very realistic option for Ireland. But O'Dwyer was totally against the idea of Home Rule for Ireland, and in fact he brought his father, according to his own memoirs, had been his health had been damaged by the activities of agrarian agitators in Ireland, and this made O'Dwyer very much against the campaign for what's called a land war, where the Anglo-Irish landlords were eventually bought out and their estates divided among the Irish tenant farmers, most of whom were Catholic, of course. But O'Dwyer actually took the opposite view. He felt that India, if it wasn't firmly governed, was going to go the way of Ireland. And of course, while he didn't order the massacre at Amritsar by General Dyer, he he applauded it and took all the credit for it, to the point, of course, that in 1940 he was actually assassinated. Now, to just show you of the involvement of the Catholic Irish middle classes in Ireland, I'm speaking a little bit about my own family. And this is not an exercise in vanity on my part, it's just to show how much the Catholic Irish population were involved in the British Empire in India. So if you look at Michael Potter, he was a cousin of my great-great-grandfather. He was an engineer with the Public Works Department in India, and he died in Surat in 1874. You can see he died quite young at the age of 29. A great many Europeans in India, of course, died from tropical diseases as they were known. But if you look then at his first cousin then, Dr. Henry Potter was a medical doctor. He was a surgeon in the Indian Army. And he retired with the rank of colonel in the Indian Army. But he served with the Indian Medical Department in Bengal, and 3 of his 4 children were born in India. Now, Dr. Henry Potter had to return to Ireland at least once because his health broke down, but he managed to recuperate and went back to India again. But he retired eventually to Ireland. And his son then, who was Henry William Ross Potter, he followed his father by joining the Indian Army, and he served with the Indian Army in the First World War and was killed in action at the Battle of Givenchy. And lastly then, a brother of Dr. Henry Potter and uncle of Henry William Ross Potter, a man called James Barry Potter, he was a lawyer, and he was employed as an attorney in the Bombay Judicial Department. So you can see that one family now, 4 of its members were involved in British India in the 19th century, and that was by no means untypical. It was quite commonplace, in fact. Of course, it's better known, of course, that many of the Governor-Generals and Viceroys of India were Irish, and of course they were all drawn from the Anglo-Irish, from the Protestant landed elite. So, for example, the Marquess Wellesley, the elder brother of the Duke of Wellington, he played a major role in expanding the British Empire in India. He built, of course, the great vice-regal palace in what was then called Calcutta, which is now, I think, used by the government of the state there. Lord Moira was the Governor-General of India when the final conquest of India occurred in around 1816 to 1818. Sir John Lawrence, we've already mentioned in passing, he was a major figure at the time of the Great Rebellion. Lord Mayo was I think he was the only Viceroy or Governor-General who was assassinated when he was visiting a penal colony on the Andaman Islands, and he was assassinated. And Lord Dufferin then is an interesting character. He was the Viceroy when the Indian Congress was established in 1885, and far from being sympathetic to the Congress, he immediately jumped to the conclusion that they were the same as Parnell and the Home Rule movement in Ireland, and he was very unsympathetic because he could see that British rule in Ireland was beginning to crumble, that the tenant farmers were going to buy out the estates of the landed elite to which he belonged, but also, of course, from 1885 onwards, Charles Stewart Parnell had created a very strong Irish party in the British House of Commons, and then Gladstone in 1885, the same year as Congress was established in India, he came out then, the great British Prime Minister, and declared he was in favour of Irish Home Rule. Home Rule, of course, meant that Ireland would have its own government to still remain within the British Empire. So Dufferin was actually totally against any self-government for India, as indeed was Lord Lansdowne. So not only were they not sympathetic to Ireland, but in fact they were less sympathetic perhaps than some of the English and Scottish viceroys, because they were coming from a society a bit like the French in Algeria, because as many of you probably know, the French community in Algeria were far more hostile to the Muslim Algerian population than, say, the population of metropolitan France itself, because they felt under threat from them. Now, if you look at the missionaries then, that's the third area in the British Empire that the Irish played a major role. And the main missionary movement, Christian missionaries I should say, were Presbyterians and Catholic, Roman Catholic. There was also, of course, Church of Ireland, Anglican missionaries in India. Now today, of course, the population, the Christian population in India is still relatively small, about 30 million I think, but it does have a fairly high public profile, and of course then it's concentrated to certain parts of India as well. But the first lady there was Amy Carmichael. She was a Presbyterian missionary who worked in India at the end of the 19th and for much of the 20th century. And her major crusade was to combat the issues created by young girls being given as gifts to temples in southern India. So she spent a lot of her life campaigning against that. And she was a Presbyterian. The man on the right then is, his name is, I have to check this now because I actually sometimes forget his name, but his name is Joseph Colgan. Now he was the first Archbishop of Madras, which I think has the largest Catholic population of any diocese in Catholic diocese in India. But of course, very interestingly, how the Irish flourished in some respects in the British Empire was they controlled the whole Roman Catholic Church in the British Empire. In Australia, in New Zealand, in Britain itself, in Canada, the Catholic Church was largely under the control of Irish Catholics. And of course, outside the British Empire, the other great Anglo or English-speaking empire, the United States, of course, the Irish Catholic population, they also controlled the Catholic Church in the United States for many years. Likewise in India, most of the Catholic missionaries who came to India in the 19th century and most of the Catholic bishops were from Ireland. And this gentleman, Joseph Colgan, he was the last bishop of Madras, but then in 1886 he was promoted to Archbishop of Madras. Of course, the history of the missionaries, the Irish missionaries in India, of course, could take a whole hour or so on its own, but suffice to say that initially the British didn't welcome Christian missionaries, either Catholic or Protestant, because they felt that they were going to upset the Hindu and Muslim populations. But later on they were permitted, and they continued to flourish in India, of course, until after independence. But nowadays, of course, the Christian churches in India, the Catholic Church certainly is mainly Indian, and I think there are hardly any Irish missionaries left in India now. If there are, they'll be quite elderly. But then, of course, there was other connections between Ireland and India, where a number of Irish people became very enthralled with Indian civilization and also became involved in the Indian independence movement. And of course, Indian independence and Irish independence, the two movements really were, of course, again part of a great worldwide phenomenon where nationalism spread all over the world. Initially, of course, in Europe, where countries like Ireland was very similar to places like Poland and Romania and Finland and what's now the Czech Republic. They were either under the Austrian Empire or the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire. And then, of course, later then, nationalism spread then to the outside of Europe then. And India, of course, was one of the first countries to embrace the originally European concept of nationalism. But Margaret Noble was also an interesting figure because she was a Protestant lady from what's now Northern Ireland, she was born in a place called Dungannon in County Tyrone, which is still part of the UK. But she became a convert to Hinduism, and she took the name then of Sister Nivedita. And again, it's easy to go off the point here, but there was a huge Hindu revival in the 19th century, of course, because Hinduism had gone underground, I suppose, to some degree under the regimes of the various Muslim dynasties. But in the 19th century then, Hinduism revived very much, and Buddhism as well indeed. And for the first time, I suppose, Hinduism became aware of itself as being one religion. Before that, people in India who were Hindus didn't think of themselves as being Hindu no more than Buddhists. For example, Buddhists in Korea and Buddhists in, say, in Tibet, they wouldn't have felt any affinity with each other. It was only when they were brought into contact with the Western world and they suddenly, it sort of created the concept of being part of this great community. And of course that's how nationalism got underway as well. But Sister Nivedita then, the fact that she had converted to Hinduism wasn't considered a problem by a lot of people, but when she became interested in Indian nationalism, of course, it did become a problem. And she was very much part of the Bengal Renaissance, which was to a large extent the beginning of Indian nationalism. And another couple of Irish people who were very much part of that movement were Margaret and James Cousins. They were a married couple who became very much interested in Indian philosophy, Indian religions. A lot of the interest in Indian culture and Indian religion was created in Europe in the 19th and early 20th century by the Theosophy, which was a sort of, it didn't call itself a religion, but it was almost a new religion. And although it was established by a Russian lady called Madame Blavatsky, one of the leading figures in it was actually a lady called Annie Besant. And although she was born in England, she had an Irish mother, and she was very conscious of her Irish roots, and she was very much also interested, Annie Besant that is, in self-government for both India and Ireland. Margaret Cousins and her husband had a similar trajectory, but Margaret Cousins is probably most famous for the fact that, well, first of all, she was very much in favour of female emancipation, women's rights, as indeed was Margaret Noble. But Margaret Cousins then played a major role when Rabindranath Tagore wrote the Indian national anthem, and when what became the Indian national anthem, I should say, when it was first performed, or one of its earliest performances in 1919, it occurred at an event at which Margaret Cousins was present, and she then actually, when speaking to Tagore, she wrote down the anthem in musical terms, and by so doing then she preserved it. So she is a major figure in the genesis of the Indian national anthem, as well as being a major figure in other ways. And then, of course, we have Max Arthur MacAuliffe, who's actually, again, County Limerick man, and he was a member of the Indian Civil Service from County Limerick, but he became very interested in the Sikh religion, to the point that he converted to Sikhism, as you can see there in the picture on the right. You can see the transition that he made from Western to Indian culture. But he also translated a great deal of the Granth, the holy books of the Sikh religion, into English. So he's still revered as one of the great figures in Sikhism, and indeed in Limerick recently, in County Limerick, there was we had a lot of commemorations of Max Arthur MacAuliffe. So his role, which was virtually forgotten, certainly in Limerick and in Ireland until very recently, is now being recognised. I suppose I'm coming now toward the end, and I'm looking, I suppose, at the episode in Ireland-Indian relations that's probably the best known, is the commonalities of the two nationalist movements. And there was a tremendous interest in the Irish nationalist movement in India, because, of course, both were under the British Empire, both were influenced by the sort of a great many of the leaders of the Indian nationalist movement were, of course, educated in England, like Gandhi and Nehru and so on, and were familiar with Ireland from that connection. And then, of course, the fight for Irish freedom then, which occurred between 1916 and 1923, that acted as a great example to India. Now, it's often been said that some of the works that I mentioned there, they have stated that there wasn't a particularly strong collaboration between the Irish and Indian national movement. They didn't work together, sort of. It was more that Ireland provided an example. Obviously, if Ireland was able to gain self-government within the British Empire, then there was no reason why India could not do so. But I think the coincidence of the Irish War of Independence between 1919 and 1921, and then of course the Amritsar massacre of 1919, which brought about Gandhi's radicalisation, and he became the leader of the Congress Party. And then from then onwards, then the purpose of the Congress movement was to gain independence for India, not just some sort of self-government. And so this was recognised then, of course. Eventually, when Eamon de Valera became leader of Ireland in 1932, and he really evolved the concept of being independent and even being a republic, but remaining within the British Commonwealth. Because, of course, the earlier members of the British Commonwealth, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on, they all kept the British monarch as their ruler. And even to this day, of course, as we saw at the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II there a few weeks ago, you know, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, she's still the queen of those three countries and a lot of other smaller countries as well, mainly in the Caribbean and in the Pacific. But de Valera established the Irish Constitution in 1937. He established a presidency in Ireland in 1938, but still Ireland remained the United Kingdom. So then when India became independent in 1947, India immediately moved to become a republic, and the example of Ireland was very strong there. Ironically, when India was moving to become a republic, Ireland actually left the Commonwealth completely in 1949. And it is believed that the British were so shocked by Ireland's departure from the Commonwealth that when India then announced that it was becoming a republic and remaining in the Commonwealth, they made every effort to sort of redefine the Commonwealth so that it could accommodate an Indian republic. So that was how Ireland played a major role, I think, in the development of the two nationalist movements. And of course, Nehru and de Valera, it would probably be an exaggeration to say they were friends, but they certainly knew each other, and they met on a number of occasions. Nehru came to Ireland, as I showed there, in 1949, and around the same time, de Valera had lost power as what we now call Taoiseach, Irish Prime Minister. But he then undertook a tour of a large part of the world, and in India he met Nehru, who of course had become Prime Minister of India only a couple of years before that. I suppose a very important chapter then in the cultural history of the two. I mean, we've already seen how going back to the Indo-Europeans, there was a common roots between the Celts, the Irish, and the various Indo-Aryan peoples that moved into India, and the various languages of the various Indo-European languages in India. But in more modern times, a friendship developed between the great Irish poet W.B. Yeats and the great Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, they were almost contemporaries because they were both born. I know Yeats was born in 1865, and I think Tagore was born around 1861. I'd have to check that now. And then Yeats died in 1939, and I think Tagore died in 1941, so they were almost the same age. And Yeats, of course, again you see what are they called again? Theosophists. They were very influential in both of their careers. Yeats, who had been born a Protestant, spent most of his life trying to find another religious background, a basis to his existence, and he was very influenced by Theosophy, and that created then, of course, a strong bond between himself and Tagore. And then, of course, friction developed between the pair of them, then, as many of you probably know, because when Tagore became the first Indian to get the Nobel Prize, Yeats was very influential and very helpful to him in that. But then later on, it became a source of friction because Yeats himself, not so much, but some of his supporters then claimed that really Tagore wouldn't have got the Nobel Prize at all, only for Yeats. So of course that didn't obviously go down well at all with Tagore, and the relation between them got cooler. But it's very interesting to see how there was a great Irish Renaissance from 1890 to 1920, when many of the great cultural figures that have made a worldwide impact from Ireland, people like Yeats, Lady Gregory, George Bernard Shaw and so on, Oscar Wilde even, although they're not often considered to be part of that movement. And then you had the Bengal Renaissance at much the same period. And so that was one of the most interesting episodes in the history of the two countries. And I suppose I'll finish then with the most contemporary and in many respects one of the most interesting connections between India and Ireland, namely the career here of Radcliffe, whose father is Indian and his mother is Irish, and who has been the Taoiseach in Ireland, the Prime Minister, and is due to become so again later on this year. And I think it's actually very interesting how the relationship between Ireland and India, which goes back to the time of the Indo-Europeans, is actually going to be very much highlighted again in December of this year, in a few months' time, when Leo Varadkar takes over again as Irish Prime Minister, as Irish Taoiseach. So thank you very much for your time anyway. Will I take questions, or do you want to?
I had one question. I was wondering if I got that correctly from what you were saying.
Yes.
It's rather a new thought that what I gathered
Yes.
was that Sanskrit was brought to India. Is that correct?
Yes. That's a controversial area, of course, because there is also a theory that Indo-European languages all started in India and moved out of India. But, and now I'm not a philologist or an expert in the area, but I understand that the consensus is that the Indo-European languages started in what's now Ukraine and southern Russia, and so that Sanskrit and all the other languages in the Indo-European language family, they would all have come from that area, or at least their origins would lie in that area. Now, it could be argued that Sanskrit wasn't actually the language that was spoken by the Indo-Aryans when they came to India. Sanskrit evolved later on, in the same way as Irish, as we know it now in Ireland, was not the same language as the language that the Celts were speaking when they came to Ireland. It developed from that language. There's a language called, the scholars have recreated a language, they call it Proto-Indo-European. By looking at all the different Indo-European languages, they've kind of traced it back, and they have posited the theory that the original Indo-Europeans spoke the one language. In the same way, for example, as French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian evolved from Latin, that this Proto-Indo-European was the language of the original Indo-Europeans, and then all the other languages then in the family evolved from them.
Because I think there's the thinking that many of the so-called Dravidian languages,
Yes.
that's Malayalam, Telugu, Tamil, and Kannada, actually have Sanskrit as a root, not the other way around.
Yes, I know that Sanskrit influenced those languages very much because we say, I suppose, what you might call traditional Indian, for want of a better word, Hindu civilization. It started, it had its cradle in sort of the Indo-Gangetic plain, and then it spread from there then down to southern India, and then of course it spread out to Southeast Asia as well, but not obviously to the same degree as it did in India itself. Because I was reading one book recently which made the point that before the Emperor Ashoka, Buddhism was only confined, it was only one of many different groups in North India, only in a small Magadha, that's the right pronunciation.
Yeah,
Magadha. And likewise, the sort of the culture of Sanskrit spread from that sort of cradle and then spread down to the rest of India and then out of India then into Southeast Asia. Because apparently Sanskrit was the language of all educated people in, say, places like Thailand, Myanmar, and large parts of Java and so on would have been speaking Sanskrit and would have been practicing Hinduism and Buddhism for centuries before Islam. Then, of course, in the case of Indonesia and in Malaya, displaced them. But of course, lots of the cultures of those countries are still heavily Indianized. Because I think somebody made the comment slightly ironically, the largest Indian temple in the world is actually in Angkor, in Cambodia. You know. Anything else?
When Ireland decided to leave Commonwealth, was there any debate, or what did people in Ireland feel?
There was a debate, right, because I think what happened was that, you see, the two major political parties in Ireland at the time were Fianna Fáil, which was founded by Eamon de Valera and headed by him for many years, and it was he who had established the present constitution in Ireland and established the concept of having a president and everything. And of course, before that, no dominion in the British Empire had a president. They all had the king as head of state. But then in 1948, de Valera lost power then after 16 years. He was very much like Nero in that he was Prime Minister for an extremely long time. But then another government was established then. It was a coalition which was dominated by Fine Gael, which is now the party, of course, of Leo Varadkar, in fact. But there was a sense that they wanted to move the constitutional position of Ireland a bit further on, because there was ambiguity in Ireland. People didn't know exactly were we in the Commonwealth or were we not in the Commonwealth. So the idea was also, it was felt that if Ireland was actually formally declared a republic, which happened in 1949, it would also put an end to the IRA sort of factions that were still in existence, although they were very small. But all that happened really was that by Ireland becoming a republic, then it left the Commonwealth. And but the debate was fairly muted, because Ireland had already been a de facto republic, really, once we had a president, and the whole, whereas Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, they had a very strong sense, well, certainly Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, not so much, they had a very strong sense of being under the British Crown. In Ireland, there was no sense, in the 26 counties that the Republic of Ireland, there was no sense of any loyalty to the British Crown at all, you know, very much the opposite, in fact.
Like you mentioned that when the British Army started recruiting, they also recruited a lot of Irish Catholic soldiers.
That's right.
So was there some kind of mistrust issue? Because Irish people are fighting for independence, and then very large number of Irish Catholics are being recruited in the army.
Well, there was a certain amount of contradiction there, right? But I suppose it should be said that the period, the Irish prominence in the British Army was mainly a feature, Irish Catholic prominence in the British Army was mainly a feature of the first half of the 19th century, whereas the Irish nationalist movement became much more significant in the second half of the 19th century. But there was also a sense that the vast bulk of the Catholics who joined the British Army, you know, there wasn't any particular fear of them becoming a threat to British rule, because they joined mainly for economic reasons as well. The British Army was a sort of, because there was very widespread poverty in Ireland, especially before the famine, and there had been a tradition of Irish Catholics joining European armies in the 18th century. Because of the penal laws in Ireland, which discriminated against Protestants, Irish Catholics weren't able to join the British Army. But the minute the British Army was opened up, then they actually joined in large numbers, which kind of proved that it was really economic rather than ideological reasons that motivated them.
I think this is again a common factor why a lot of Indians joined Indian army.
Yeah, it was also
went for World War I, World War II. So again, probably that would have been a economic.
I would think so. I would think so. Yeah. And all the empires. I mean, again, I mentioned the French. You know, during the Algerian War from 1954 to 1962, there were more Muslim Algerians fighting in the French army than fighting for independence. I think by a factor of about 4. I think there was about 200,000 Algerians in the French army and about 50,000 rebels fighting against them. So, but I think the common denominator throughout all of this, and the same with the Russian army and the Dutch in Indonesia and so on, I think it was economic factors that motivated people to join these, and also spirit of adventure then as well. And you know, I think it's almost the same as nowadays. I don't think most people, when they join the Irish army, certainly they don't kind of make a conscious choice that I'm doing this because I'm a strong patriot. I think they do it mainly for economic reasons, or because they like the idea of having an exciting career or whatever, you know.
Also, one issue what you mentioned from the Central Asia, the so-called Indo-European linguistic groups, they started moving westward.
That's right.
To which period is commonly accepted?
It's very much debated now. I think the Proto-Indo-European could go back to about 2 or 2,500 BC. And the first state that emerged that was speaking an Indo-European language was the Hittite Empire, which existed it was a contemporary of ancient Egypt, and it existed in what is now Turkey, in Asia Minor. And the Hittites were an Indo-European speaking people. And
so they first started from Central Asia, then went to Egypt.
some of the say when the new kingdom, I'm trying to remember now off the top of my head, when the new kingdom of Egypt was overthrown around 1000 BC, it's thought that it's only a theory now, of course, but that the invaders that overthrew it were Indo-Europeans. But the other thing was the Indo-Europeans, and they went east as well, insofar as they went as far east as what's now Mongolia and Xinjiang and Central Asia, which is dominated now by Turkic-speaking peoples. Before the sort of 5th or 6th century AD, was mainly, there was a whole series of Iranian-speaking peoples living there. Then they were displaced then by the Turks and Turkic-speaking people. So, you know, the Indo-Europeans they spread in a very widely, but then they were displaced then from Central Asia. But then of course they expanded then with the European empires all over into America and every place, you know. But it was one of the biggest revelations that when some of the British in India discovered that Sanskrit was so similar to Greek and Latin, it would be the same as if somebody realized that Chinese, we say, was a similar language to English. You know, it was a complete shock to them. And then they suddenly realized, you know, there wasn't this huge gap between the Europe and the rest of the world, you know.
So when the Indo-Europeans came from Central Asia, then they also destroyed the pre-existing culture civilizations in Europe.
Well, you see, they definitely destroyed the existing cultures. Yes, the language in particular, they would have. They were associated, of course, as well with the use of bronze and iron, of course, as well. For example, Hittites were the first state in the ancient Middle East to use iron, for example. But it was more a question that they were a new elite that would say, for example, when the Celts came to Ireland, that they didn't come in huge numbers. They would have come in small numbers, but they conquered the existing population, and that existing population took on their culture and particularly their language. And likewise in France, or Gaul, of course, as it was called by the Romans, and Spain and so on. And the existing nations weren't actually displaced, but their culture was displaced in that their language and of course their religion as well, because there's a lot of commonalities in the indigenous religions of the different Indo-European peoples. Like there's common gods and goddesses, common mythologies between all of the Indo-European peoples, which of course were obscured to some degree then by the conversion of so many of the Europeans to Christianity, for example. But there was a lot of work to be done that the Celtic gods and goddesses would be similar, for example, to the Hindu gods and goddesses, you know. So they did destroy, I suppose, the existing culture. But there's so little known then, you see, about what was the culture of the people in Europe before the Indo-Europeans arrived, you know.
With this, we come to an end to today's program. On behalf of the embassy and on behalf of our viewers, I thank Mr. Potter for taking out time to enlighten us on the historical connections between Ireland and India going back to